On a December morning in 1917, a ship packed with explosives caught fire in a crowded harbor, and hundreds of people gathered at their windows to watch it burn. Then it detonated. It was the largest man-made explosion in human history up to that point, so vast it would not be surpassed until the atomic bomb. In an instant, a huge part of a thriving city was flattened, nearly 2,000 people were killed, and thousands more were blinded and maimed. This is the story of the Halifax Explosion. It is a story of a wartime accident, a collision in a narrow channel, a fire that drew crowds instead of scattering them, and a blast so powerful it hurled a ship's anchor for kilometers and triggered a wave that swept the shore. It is one of the deadliest disasters in Canadian history, and one that, outside of the city it destroyed, is far too little remembered. This is below. In 1917, the First World War was raging in Europe, and the Canadian city of Halifax, in Nova Scotia, had become one of the most important ports on the Atlantic. Its magnificent natural harbor was a gathering point for convoys carrying troops, supplies, and munitions across the ocean to the war. The harbor bustled with ships of every kind, and the narrow channel connecting the outer harbor to the inner basin, known as the Narrows, was one of the busiest stretches of water in the world. The war had transformed the sleepy port into a frantic hub. Ships assembled here in great convoys before running the gauntlet of German submarines across the Atlantic. Security was tight, the harbor was congested, and munition ships, carrying the explosives that fed the Western Front, moved through the same crowded waters as passenger ferries and fishing boats. It was an accident waiting to happen, and on that December morning, it finally did. On the morning of the 6th of December, a French cargo ship called the Mont Blanc was making her way into the harbor. And the Mont Blanc was, in effect, a floating bomb. She was crammed, from keel to deck, with a staggering cargo of high explosives bound for the war, tons of TNT and picric acid, along with highly flammable benzol stored in drums on her deck. She was one of the most dangerous ships afloat, a vessel that should never have been allowed anywhere near a crowded city. Her captain, Am Lemedic, and the harbor pilot guiding her, Francis Mackey, knew exactly how lethal their vessel was. They crept toward the harbor with extreme caution. But caution was not enough in a channel this crowded, on a morning when another ship was running late, out of position, and coming the wrong way. The stage was set not by malice or recklessness, but by the ordinary friction of too many ships in too little water. To grasp the danger, consider what she actually carried. In her holds were thousands of tons of high explosives, TNT and picric acid, a substance even more volatile, along with gun cotton, and on her decks, drums of benzol, a highly flammable fuel. In total, nearly 3,000 tons of explosive material. She had been loaded in New York and sent north to join a convoy. By the rules of the day, such a ship was not even allowed to fly a red warning flag, for fear of advertising her deadly cargo to enemy spies. Coming the other way, outbound through the Narrows, was a Norwegian ship called the Imo. Through a series of misjudgments and miscommunications over which side to pass on, the two vessels found themselves on a collision course in the tight channel. Despite last-minute maneuvers, the Imo's bow struck the Mont Blanc on her side. The collision itself was relatively minor. But it was catastrophic, because of what the Mont Blanc was carrying, and what happened next. The actual impact was almost gentle. The Imo's bow cut only a few meters into the Mont Blanc's forward hold, and under normal circumstances it would have been a minor fender bender of the seas, an incident for the insurers and nothing more. But as the Imo reversed engines and wrenched free, the scraping of steel on steel threw sparks, and the toppled benzol drums spilled their contents across the deck. Within moments, the most dangerous ship in the harbor was on fire. The Imo was in a hurry. Delayed the day before, she was steaming through the Narrows faster than she should have, and had drifted onto the wrong side of the channel while passing other traffic. As the two ships approached, a frantic exchange of whistle signals followed, each captain trying to tell the other which way he intended to turn. But the signals conflicted, both ships turned at the wrong moment, and their combined maneuvers steered them directly into one another. As the Imo pulled away, the grinding of metal and the toppling of the benzol drums on the Mont Blanc's deck sparked a fire. Flames erupted among the barrels of flammable liquid, and the crew of the Mont Blanc understood immediately what was beneath their feet: thousands of tons of high explosive, now burning. They knew the ship was going to blow. And they knew there was nothing they could do to stop it. They had no firefighting capacity that could touch a blaze feeding on benzol and threatening thousands of tons of TNT. To stay aboard was simply to die for nothing. So the captain gave the order to abandon ship. The entire crew, save for a single man, would survive, rowing hard for the Dartmouth shore on the far side of the harbor and then running for the woods, bracing for the blast they knew was coming. The crew did the only thing they could. They abandoned ship, scrambling into lifeboats and rowing frantically for the far shore, screaming warnings as they went. But they were shouting in French, and the people on the Halifax side could not understand them. Meanwhile, the burning, unmanned Mont Blanc, wreathed in dramatic flames and black smoke, drifted slowly toward the Halifax waterfront and came to rest against a pier. For about 20 minutes, the abandoned Mont Blanc burned against Pier 6, throwing up a spectacular plume of oily black smoke shot through with flame. 20 minutes. It was enough time for word to spread, for workers and families and schoolchildren to gather and stare, and it would have been enough time to flee, if only anyone had understood. Those 20 minutes were both the disaster's warning and, cruelly, the reason so many were in exactly the wrong place when it ended. And here lies the terrible heart of the tragedy. A ship on fire in the harbor was a spectacle. Word spread, and people stopped to watch. Workers paused at the docks. Families came to their windows. Children pressed their faces to the glass. Nobody in the crowd had any idea that the burning ship was a colossal bomb. To them, it was a dramatic but harmless fire, a bit of excitement on a cold morning. They gathered to watch, by the hundreds, entirely unaware that they were standing at the edge of an abyss. Some who did sense danger tried to warn others. A few sailors and dock workers, piecing together what the ship might be carrying, shouted for people to run. Fire crews raced toward the pier to fight the blaze, unaware they were rushing toward a bomb. Almost the entire crew of one responding fire engine would be killed. The instincts that serve us in an ordinary emergency, to gather, to help, to watch, all funneled more people toward the blast. But at least one man understood, and his choice became legendary. Vince Coleman was a railway dispatcher working near the waterfront. Warned by a sailor of what the Mont Blanc carried, he and a colleague began to flee. And then Coleman remembered something. An incoming passenger train, carrying hundreds of people, was due at the station any minute, headed straight into the blast zone. He turned back to his telegraph key. Coleman stayed at his post and tapped out an urgent message to halt the incoming trains. Accounts of his final words vary, but they amounted to a desperate warning that a munitions ship was on fire and about to explode, and that this was likely his last message. He kept sending until the very end. His warning is credited with stopping trains and saving many lives. Vince Coleman died at his telegraph key, one of the disaster's great heroes, sacrificing himself to warn others. The story of Vince Coleman endured because it distilled something noble out of the horror. He was an ordinary man who, given seconds to save himself, chose instead to spend them saving strangers he would never meet. His telegraph messages rippled down the line, halting trains that would otherwise have rolled full of passengers into the heart of the destruction. He has been remembered ever since as the disaster's most human face, a small, deliberate act of courage against an onrushing catastrophe. At 4 minutes past 9 in the morning, the fire reached the main cargo, and the Mont Blanc detonated. The explosion was almost beyond comprehension. In a fraction of a second, some 2,900 tons of high explosive released their energy at once. The ship was utterly vaporized, blown to fragments. A blinding flash and a towering column of smoke rose over the city. It remains, to this day, one of the largest accidental explosions ever, and the largest man-made blast before the invention of nuclear weapons. In modern terms, the blast released energy roughly equivalent to nearly 3 kilotons of TNT, a significant fraction of the power of an early atomic bomb. For an instant, the temperature at the center reached thousands of degrees, and the ship and the water around it were superheated. Windows shattered more than 80 kilometers away. The concussion was felt and heard at astonishing distances, a deep boom rolling across the whole of Nova Scotia. The force was almost unimaginable. Fragments of the Mont Blanc were hurled across the city, some for kilometers. Part of her anchor shaft, weighing over half a ton, was flung several kilometers through the air. The blast created a pressure wave that flattened buildings, and then a fireball, and then, in the harbor, the displaced water surged up into a tsunami that swept over the shore, dragging people and wreckage back into the sea. A district of the city simply ceased to exist. The tsunami was its own horror. The explosion momentarily shoved the harbor water aside, briefly bearing the seabed, and then the water rushed back in a wave that some accounts put at many meters high. It surged over the shoreline, smashing what the blast had spared and pulling victims into the harbor. Across the water at Tufts Cove, a small Mi'kmaq community was struck by both blast and wave and was effectively wiped from existence, one of many worlds erased in that single minute. The neighborhood nearest the blast, a working-class district called Richmond, was almost completely destroyed. In an area of roughly 2 square kilometers, buildings were leveled, homes collapsed, and factories crumpled. Fires broke out everywhere as overturned stoves and lamps ignited the wreckage of shattered wooden houses, trapping many of the injured in the flames. In moments, a living neighborhood had become a smoking field of rubble. The human toll was staggering. Roughly 2,000 people were killed, and around 9,000 more were injured, in a city of only about 50,000. Nearly 1 in 5 residents was killed or hurt. Entire families were wiped out. Children on their way to school, workers at their benches, mothers in their kitchens, all were caught in the blast. It was, at a stroke, one of the deadliest single events in the history of Canada. The stories of individual survival are almost unbearable. Whole families vanished in an instant. A baby, later nicknamed Ashpan Annie, was reportedly found alive in the ashes beneath a collapsed stove that had shielded her, the sole survivor of her household. Rescuers pulling through the rubble found the living pinned beside the dead. For those who lived, the day divided their lives permanently into before and after. And there was a particular, awful signature to the injuries. Because so many people had been standing at their windows, watching the fire, when the blast wave hit, it shattered every pane of glass in the city and drove the fragments inward at lethal speed. Countless people were struck in the face and eyes by flying glass. The Halifax Explosion produced an epidemic of eye injuries and blindness so large that it advanced the treatment of such wounds for years to come. Hundreds lost their sight for the crime of looking out a window. So many eyes were damaged that Halifax became, grimly, a center for the study and treatment of eye trauma. Doctors treating the flood of blinding injuries learned lessons that would improve ophthalmic surgery for years afterward. It is a bitter kind of progress, medicine advanced by mass suffering, but it was real. The disaster left the city with a population of the newly blind, and a hard-won body of knowledge about how to treat such wounds. In the shattered city, the survivors faced a nightmare. The injured lay everywhere amid the burning rubble. Rescue efforts began immediately, with dazed and wounded people digging through the wreckage for the trapped and the dead. Improvised hospitals and morgues were set up. And then, as if the disaster were not complete, nature delivered a final cruelty. The very next day, a blizzard descended on Halifax, burying the ruins in snow and hampering the desperate rescue and relief work. The blizzard dumped heavy snow on a city with no shelter for its wounded and no roofs on its houses. Survivors who had escaped the blast now faced freezing to death in the ruins. And yet the storm, in a strange way, also put out some of the fires. Rescue workers dug through snow-covered rubble by hand, searching for anyone still alive beneath the wreckage, in bitter cold, with the smell of smoke still hanging over the shattered streets. Help poured in from across the region, and one source of aid became especially famous. The American city of Boston, in the neighboring state of Massachusetts, responded with extraordinary speed and generosity, sending trains loaded with medical staff, supplies, and money to the stricken city. That kindness was never forgotten. To this day, more than a century later, the province of Nova Scotia sends a giant Christmas tree to Boston every year, as a living thank you for the help that came in its darkest hour. A formal body, the Halifax Relief Commission, was created to manage the enormous task of caring for the survivors, rebuilding homes, and paying pensions to the maimed and the orphaned, work that would continue for decades. The scale of need was overwhelming, an entire district to rebuild and thousands of shattered lives to somehow put back together. The recovery was not a matter of months, but of a generation. In the search for blame, the courts became a battleground. Inquiries and lawsuits tried to determine who was responsible for the collision, the Mont Blanc or the Imo. At first the blame fell heavily on the Mont Blanc, but after years of legal wrangling and appeals, responsibility was ultimately judged to be shared between the two ships. In truth, it was a chain of small errors and miscommunications in a crowded wartime channel that had led, step by step, to catastrophe. The legal fight ground on for years, all the way to the highest courts. The pilot, Francis Mackey, was for a time made a scapegoat, arrested and vilified, before the case against him collapsed and he was eventually cleared. In the end, the court settled on shared responsibility between the two ships. No single villain could be found, because there was none. There was only a sequence of ordinary decisions that, combined, had proved apocalyptic. There is a chilling footnote to the Halifax explosion. Because it was the largest man-made blast the world had yet seen, it became, in a grim way, a scientific reference point. When scientists later worked on the atomic bomb, the Halifax disaster stood as one of the few real-world examples of an explosion approaching that scale. A harbor accident in 1917 offered an early, terrible glimpse of the destructive power that humanity would soon unleash deliberately. The disaster also gave birth to something unexpected, the modern study of disasters themselves. A Halifax clergyman and scholar named Samuel Prince wrote a pioneering academic analysis of how the city and its people responded to the catastrophe. It is often regarded as one of the first serious works of disaster sociology, the beginning of a whole field devoted to understanding how communities break down and pull together in the face of sudden calamity. Halifax did not die. In the years after the disaster, the shattered Richmond district was rebuilt, and the city recovered, though the scars, physical and emotional, ran deep for generations. Survivors carried the memory of that morning for the rest of their lives, and the city built memorials to the dead. But beyond Halifax itself, the story faded from wider memory, overshadowed by the enormity of the world war that had, indirectly, caused it. That overshadowing is part of why it faded. The Halifax explosion happened in the middle of a war that was killing millions, and its nearly 2,000 dead, staggering as they were folded into the vast grief of 1917. A single city's catastrophe, however immense, struggled to hold the world's attention against the backdrop of the trenches. And so, outside Nova Scotia, it slowly slipped toward the margins of memory. Strip the Halifax explosion down to its cause, and it is a story of wartime necessity colliding with ordinary human error. A ship was loaded with a monstrous cargo of explosives because a war demanded it, and sent into a crowded civilian harbor because that was the system. Then a routine navigational dispute, the kind that happened 100 times a day, went wrong at the worst possible moment, with the worst possible ship. The disaster was born where the machinery of war met the smallness of human mistakes. And the cruelest detail remains the crowd at the windows. The fire that should have sent people running instead drew them in to watch, because no one understood what they were looking at. The very thing that made the burning ship a spectacle, its dramatic flames, was the overture to their destruction. It is a haunting reminder that the greatest dangers are often the ones we do not recognize, the ones we stop, curiously, to admire. Every year, when the great tree from Nova Scotia is lit in Boston, it carries that memory forward, whether the crowds who admire it know the story or not. It is a rare thing, a disaster remembered not only by its horror but by an enduring act of gratitude, a century-long thank you blowing each December. In that small tradition, the dead of Halifax are quietly honored, far from the city where they fell. So remember the Halifax explosion. Remember the floating bomb that drifted to the pier, the crowds who gathered innocently to watch, and the instant that turned a thriving district into rubble and glass. Remember the nearly 2,000 dead, the thousands blinded, and the children lost on an ordinary December morning. And remember Vince Coleman, tapping out his warning to the very end, choosing to save strangers when he could have saved himself. Below exists for exactly these stories, the disasters that reshaped cities and lives and then slipped, somehow, out of the world's memory. The famous, the forgotten, and the ones, like this, that deserve to be spoken of far more than they are. If you believe the people of Halifax should be remembered, subscribe and stay with us. This has been Below.